Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I really benefited already so much listening to Kathy and Diana and the Round Valley Feather Dancers and, music and food. And that's kind of what Cultural Fire is about. Music, food, the instruments and the food, these are all shaped by fire. These are plants shaped by fire or animals in a way shaped by fire. And so there's a cycle here in Cultural Fire that we can see. While it's been interrupted, we can really see how much diversity and abundance there is. Native health and native hands, one of the goals is to obtain sets of fire gear for native community use, functioning as volunteers, functioning as parts of teams, and create more training opportunities for native community involvement and collaborations with a whole range of entities for cultural fire access. And we want to monitor that burn success. So if I was to define success, both just the ecosystem health and also cultural uses should be increasing. And they're really connected. The using the stuff, these plants, connecting with those animals is associated with the ecosystem health. A lot of stories from around the world talk about the origin of fire for people. We think of being able to start fire, owning that fire. This is a children's book based on a Karuk traditional tale, in which Coyote is assisted by a whole number of animals to bring fire to the people. So it's a lot of animals that are participating and bringing that gift, and a plant giving that gift to people. This is from a paper on the Southwest, but it shows that not only is fire something in the household for people to have, but it's part of how we relate to the entire landscape, not just with food, but you see all these different aspects of fields of human reality permeating the entire landscape, and fire being part of all that. Because fire isn't just a practice in Northern California, it's a practice in Australia, it's a practice in the Southwest, it's a practice in Northern Canada, that went uninterrupted until 1940 in Alberta. So it's something that it connects a lot of people. For the Kinestet or Wailaki people, fire is mentioned in the origin of fire and is described as something that was used to produce abundant food. So this is a recording put in writing here from 1901, 1906, recorded in Round Valley. This is just a little brief segment showing that in the theft of fire, when the fire is gone, gathering seeds is very difficult. But when fire returns to the people, the seeds have become good. They're much easier to gather. That's tarweeds and sunflowers, which is specifically Wyethia and Balsam oryza. These are perennial sunflowers that really benefit from fire, and we'll get more details of that. And Tohdai, which is tarweed. If I call it Madia, because I'm used to this botanical language, know that the Mapuche people in Chile call it Madi. It also grows there. It's been found in archaeological deposits 13,000 years old there so far. Old traditional use in multiple continents. And fire supports this plant being on the landscape, not just in the traditional stories, but actually ecologically. So this is an example of one of the plants that are more abundant with cultural fire. I had set up this presentation to have a lot of stuff on the legislative aspect. I can come back to it, but I'm going to get to some of the more fun stuff. The groundwork that's been laid, and this is just a couple slides on that, starting way before 2021. This report says that they're seeking to support and expand California tribes' ability to burn culturally. Well, after 2021, a lot of things started happening, and Senate bills and Assembly bills were passed to define cultural fire and cultural practitioner to be much more supportive of the Native community needs. So we'll get to that at the end, and how some of the new definitions in the legislation can support common goals of Native American cultural fire practices. They had ideas of establishing programs to provide direct funding, and now there's actual opportunities for that. And I think this paper probably was a good stimulation to get the ball rolling. It talked about the barriers to good fire, and those barriers were really at the state level. There's federal level barriers, but those are being overcome with the legislation I'll get into. And this paper talks about solutions to those barriers. It's worth looking up, just a resource. You've heard already about how harvesting, adequate harvest of plants depends on cultural fire. This is a paper by Frank Lake and other people from a couple years ago showing how long it takes to forage for hazelnut basketry materials. And so the foraging time on the green, if fire is excluded, you never are able to obtain the necessary 350 stems. But if there's a wildfire, which sometimes can be more intense, you can get that 350, but look how many minutes you're spending, and then look how the ease of foraging after a cultural fire is under yellow. You get that 350 in just a couple hours of foraging. So this is the type of thing that makes cultural use of plants possible and easier for the community and for more members within the community. It's a photograph from a book called Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson. I think it's also in this paper. Kat Anderson interviewed a lot of Native American elders to put together books about this thick on traditional management of the ecosystem. But this is actually redbud. And you can see without a fire, it begins branching out, and you've heard about this. This is just an image to show you. But after a fire, it's very straight, easy to collect for traditional uses. And we've heard too about pest and pathogen control, because fire can, the trees will let go of the weevil grub infested acorns first. They're like, that's not the one I'm gonna spend time growing to maturity. And they drop those first. So a burn first can help slow down those pests and pathogens, and then make it easier to collect the good acorns later, in addition to just creating the open landscape. Of course, all these things are related to productivity. If it's easier to harvest, it's because there's more of it in part. If the plants are healthier and there's less pests, there's more productive. You can see this is the shape of tan oak. It's not crowded. It has a lot of horizontal branches. There's a lot of sunshine. It's actually an insect-pollinated tree for being an oak, and it's in the genus Lithocarpus. Insects like to visit for pollen. And so this is able to produce a lot more acorns because it has the space because of fire. This is from 1903 here in the Ukiah area anyways. So this was a purposeful abundance, right? Those historic photos or examples of contemporary success. There's a whole variety and diversity of nutritious food that could be preserved for year-round use and sometimes eaten immediately. Even today, scientists estimate that in coastal prairies and in areas like here, you can achieve more than 22 species in a square meter. You don't see them all at the same time of year because they have different life phases, different phenology. Well, that's greater than any grassland type in the US. It's more diverse than prairies of the Midwest. And actually, in some places, people have found more than 200 plants per square foot of a single edible bulb. And that one says Huatlan, which is to remind me that is Wailaki for having teeth. And I can always be corrected by Perry here, where I've learned stuff from. And we were talking about, does that mean the way the petals are pointed like teeth? Is it relating to the flower color? There's some white varieties. And I was wondering too, because the bulbs have little baby bulbs in the outside. If you ever planted bulbs and you see the ones that make little extras, those remind me of teeth too. Why were they so abundant? In part because of fire leaving these open spaces. And this abundance in some times was recorded. This is a stagecoach ride by Purdy. If you have heard of this horticulturalist guy. So in 1870, he says the trip was through lovely country. At its loveliest in mid-May, brush fires had kept the hillsides open. And he talks about how sometimes there are hundreds of acres of a single flower just en masse blooming. So it's how it was in the past. And this guy, go ahead, next slide, who is called the Lily Man of Ukiah, and his team, he recalled during his life collecting 4,000 bulbs in a 10-hour day, which is 6 a minute, which is 400 an hour. And this was for sale. They weren't eating these. They were just shipping them to the East Coast. This was some of what the abundance that was, the legacy abundance from the cultural burning. So he was selling them. You can put some of the prices there with the Wailaki name. The Brodea laxa is also known as Tritelia laxa. with Humboldt lily, some of the bulbs being, the average was more than half a pound. This is the kind of abundance and diversity of flavors and colors on the landscape that was there that's hard to find now. So the idea like, is this going to work? It was working for a long time, thousands and thousands of years. And it's harder to see that because we're looking at historical things, but we're going to be able to see more of that the more cultural fires put on the ground, especially with the plants in mind. Right, so that's from the inside. He's got the camas. They're selling camas bulbs, like I said, for 40 cents a dozen. And then that's the firecracker lily. Have you ever seen this one? It's long, red, tubular. But I want to come back to Maddie as an example of productivity that's possible. This is a plant that, I don't know about if it's most, because I'm not counting tribes, but almost throughout all of California, right? People have names for this plant. And there's different species within the genus Madia, but tarweed is a very productive, abundant plant associated with fire. And this is a paper by Frank Lake in which he says that fires were used to cure large fields of tarweed and also the grasses, and also for collecting greens, fresh greens that would come back after a cultural fire to cure large fields. So this is a plant that at the time, people were able to burn when the plant had gone to seed, and it's a sticky plant. That's why it's called tarweed. Now, I don't know why it's called weed. A lot of native plants get called that, right? Perry told me a story. He said, oh, yeah, when we'd work with the cowboys, the ranchers, they'd say, don't you come in the truck with that tarweed stuck on you, because they didn't want it around. These are things that got sprayed out. But actually, as I talk about the productivity here, those seeds were sent to Europe, Belgium, Australia, South Africa, as people were like, hey, this actually is super productive. It makes oil, it's edible, should we check it out? It never turned into one of our staple crops in industrial ag, but people are still exploring that. But I think as far as something that's on the landscape, let's talk about how it can be productive. That's a close-up of one of the species. You can see it gets seeds on the outside. It doesn't even make any on the inside. And here's another one that makes seeds on the inside and outside of the flower. And actually, it'll have seeds in anything that's closed, like on the right there, that will be full of seeds too. There's a close-up. I was looking specifically for Walecki stuff on the Hearst Museum of Anthropology anyways, and found that some of these are referenced as like, oh, it's stained with the tarweed residue because it was being used for collecting the seeds. So that's at the museum. That's a seed beater for knocking the seeds into a basket. Now there's all kinds of baskets for collecting seeds, and I have a burden basket in here, which could be used for acorns or any large amount of things. That's Walecki. The fire benefits the plants being used to make plant seed collecting materials, whether it's a digging stick for camas, or these burden baskets and such. So there's some tarweed seeds. So people have gotten between 400 and 1,600 pounds an acre. And within that, like if they crush those, you can get like in an acre, maybe like 400 gallons of oil. And it's 30% protein, 25% fat, okay? And this is something that in a traditional way is using no water whatsoever. And it is associated, it can grow along with all the bulbs and all the other trees around, okay? So it doesn't require, it's not a monoculture. It doesn't have to be that way. So let's compare that. So that's 209 feet by 209 feet. That's an acre. So it's not that big of a space to make that much food for people. Okay, that allows the other plants. Let's compare that to almonds. Okay, I wanted to do it, and I did it, and I'm happy I did it. A little bit more pounds per acre, but let's look at that. 1,600 pounds of one, which is very full of healthy fats and a lot of protein. This one's a little less protein, a little bit more fat. Almost 1 million gallons of water went into that acre, and there's nothing else growing on that acre of almonds other than almonds. And there's some businesses associated with it, yeah, for pesticides and whatever. Not so great. That's not so great, because when we think of protein source, you want to think of like enough fish in the river as well as it's a diverse diet means a diverse ecosystem. So this kind of a comparison. So this is just one more plant example to remind me what I'm talking about next. This is California chia. We have a chia here that's not from South America in California that grows it's managed by fire traditionally. This range comes up to southern Humboldt. and that's also very productive. I'm just not going to go plant by plant, okay? But I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and just say, last couple years I've been able to go to some of where the fires have been, including the August fire complex and stuff, and do botanical surveys. So I have some photos of that. So here's a lily coming back after the fire. It's amazing. A lupin, calochortus, or hairy cat's ear. This thing, the bulb is like 3 inches beneath the ground. And there's Doug firs that are 100 and some feet tall that burned all the way up, right next to it. But it's like surviving. It doesn't mean a high intensity fire can't kill it. Oh, they can. It better is low intensity and not having the crowding with Doug fir, which also suck up water like an almond in a way. And there's another one, nice bulb coming after a fire. See that plant diversity coming back. Sometimes it's the bulbs that have survived under the ground, and sometimes it's seeds that are activated by stuff. I'm going to throw one more name that stems from an indigenous name for something here. And this is something that was discovered about 10 years ago only, that one of the molecular ingredients in smoke generated by burning plants is keratin. It actually helps. You can see they did a test here. If you take that ingredient from smoke and apply it to seeds, they sprout really well as opposed to without it. And some plants are really associated with that exposure to smoke, plant smoke. And keratin was named because it was discovered by some Australian researchers, and this is what they wrote, okay? That it recognizes that the discovery is made on Noongar land. It's the Noongar, one of the Noongar words for smoke, for a kind of smoke. And people are finding that smoke will cause a lot of native wildflowers in different parts of the world to germinate and not just germinate, but grow really well. So we'll talk about keratin for a second here. It's an active molecule that helps plants grow. It stimulates germination and it increases seedling vigor, stimulates like branching beneath the ground and above ground. And I say it stimulates symbiosis with fungi, including arbuscular fungi. So these mycorrhizal fungi, some plants need that. So I want you to imagine a blueberry. It has very shallow roots, like evergreen blueberry, huckleberries. They have really shallow roots. So they need to connect with the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. Keratin is a signal pathway that says, hey, this plant needs you, fungi. Come here. You're fun. We need you. So it says, come on. And so it really helps a lot. Whereas things like star thistle or Canadian thistle, they're weeds essentially because they don't need to connect with the native fungi. And so in agricultural applications, people are looking at like, how do we spread the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi on the field to help corn, or at least it'll suppress the weeds because they don't do as well. Fire helps bring about the connection between mushrooms and native plants, especially if it's low intensity fire, because that smoke has that and other molecules in it, and it settles in the ground and helps the plants grow. This is maybe a little extra, but there was a 10th grader a couple years ago that did a state science fair on this, and what he found that under periods of drought, duress, the seeds that he gave a smoke treatment to did much better. And I don't have a slide for this, but people burn for blueberries in Maine, Nova Scotia. That's a traditional practice. And like I said, blueberries have that real thing. People there were growing squash, and they were fumigating squash in little wood boxes with moss, and smoking it over the fire. And the first European explorers said, so why are you doing that? Europeans didn't do any sort of smoke-enhanced seed germination at the time, although plenty of people have around the world and do. They said, well, because it makes squash grow well and they germinate well. So this is traditional knowledge about smoke and fire. But so he found the same thing, that even under periods of water stress, that there's a continued connection between the smoke treatment and doing well. a lot of things come back after the fire. Here's a picture of that, and they bring in other beneficial. They're calling in their helpers. So this is a bee visiting ballhead Gelia. This is a traditional food as well. All this wildflower diversity brings back a lot of bee diversity. There's like 1,600 species in California of native bee. The European honeybee wasn't brought until 1853. Honeybees pollinating camas means less camas seeds because they do a bad job pollinating. And if they're there, there's less bumblebees and other native bees visiting. So like the research on camas shows, it's a key plant for supporting bee diversity and supporting all the other plants that those bees will then go on to pollinate. It's blooming at a perfect time of year. It's attracted a whole bunch of native bees. But if honeybees are introduced to camas fields, the seed set goes down. And that's going to have an effect on the other native plants as well. So the fire is connecting with how things flow to keep things going with the food and the bees. A few more bees coming in after the fire, after flowers, because I like to take pictures of the bees. Extra slide of Nadia. I'm not done talking about like how this is also connected. That's why I need my little cue, right? So as those flowers bring in bees and a whole bunch of other invertebrates, right? This is a downstream effect, okay? There are things that will hunt the flies and the gnats and the beetles and the bees that they visit those flowers. And one of those hunters is a dragonfly. And so if dragonflies are doing well because there's a whole bunch of insects on those diversity of flowers, guess who's going to do well? Well, dragonflies, but they have a life cycle that goes underwater. This is the downstream effect. Okay, so when dragonflies lay eggs, they look for water. Dragonflies are going for water, and they're putting the eggs in water. And what that means is there's going to be dragonfly larvae, an important food for salmon and other fish. Okay, so and underwater, what you're going to see then, now we go underwater, and you're going to see the dragonfly larvae. This is supporting the salmon. Not just by supporting the water flow to the river with less dug fur and stuff, but what happens is there's a whole flow of animal life too, because so much animal life is supported once you don't have just a shaded dug fir forest. There's a whole bunch of other animals, and it goes right to the fish as well. So there's more. There they are. You can't see them. Okay. So this is a historical picture. This is probably 120 years ago or less. Where people in a day were catching so many salmon. And that was also a time people were seeing all kinds of bulbs, flowers, and diversity on the landscape as well. It was the native cultural diversity here in California that helped the native plant diversity flourish and all the animals. And it was a feedback loop that was positive. It wasn't like, well, let's tweak it this way or tweak it that way. We got to try things. But it was well-established cycle of abundance. I think one of the things I'm willing to talk about on a breakout is when cultural burns are planned, it could be worth our while to participate in a bee survey. There's a state-funded, in part, bee survey. It's called the California Bumblebee Atlas, and it's simply taking photographs of those bees, and you don't know how to identify the different kinds because there's like 26 kinds of bumblebee in California. And they pollinate things that honeybees can't. Let's go back to blueberries. Honeybees can't really. I mean, they're like 1% as effective as a bumblebee. Okay, so that's why people try to overstock because they're not that great. So, but supporting the native pollinators is really important. Basically, so California, look, northwestern California is a hotspot for bumblebee diversity, actually. And at the same time, this was the most common bumblebee 10 years ago, more like 15 now, I think. Up until 2010, this is your likelihood of encountering this bee. Just if you focus on California, that's great. Good chance of seeing it every day if you go out and look for a big part of California. If you saw a bumblebee 90% of the time, it was the western bumblebee. Okay, post 2010. This is not listed under the Endangered Species Act. It's not able to be protected under California law because it's an invertebrate, which unless it's an aquatic invertebrate, even though there's very few. But so looking for this bee is important, and this is part of what was supporting the food systems too, is that native bee diversity. So I think if we're looking for the bees before and after burns, we'll be able to show that the cultural burns are having a positive impact on both the floral diversity, and then we're supporting the bees as well. And this is the Bumblebee Atlas volunteer plug. And just talk to me if you want to, participate in that. And maybe people doing the, the different cultural burns, if they could have someone who's reaching out, like, oh, we'll make sure we do a survey before and survey after. It'd be awesome, something like that. Okay, it's an idea I'm floating here. So here's the legislative stuff, okay? I want you to hold on to all that dragonfly and abundant food stuff. 2021, this came out, which really provided some great opportunities, reasons why we have to overcome those barriers. This strategic plan was much more stronger in its wording, 2022, in that it says that they want to expand cultural burning and tribal engagement and support it, seek to better integrate tribal organizations and cultural fire practitioners into public agency prescribed fire projects and programs. This is passed, this is done, this is the law here in California. Cultural burn is the intentional application of fire to the land by Native American tribes, tribal organizations, or cultural fire practitioners to achieve cultural goals or objectives, including subsistence, ceremonial activities, biodiversity, and other benefits. And a practitioner is a person associated with a Native American tribe or tribal organization with experience in burning to meet cultural goals or objectives, including subsistence, ceremonial activities, biodiversity, or other benefits. So those are some inclusive definitions. And then also there are exemptions within that. So if you're meeting those definitions, these things aren't required anymore. You don't have to conduct in compliance with the written prescription. Person certified as a burn boss, that's no longer necessary. But you have to meet those other two criteria. And of course you need permission, and you still need to do like your air quality statement. There's other things still required, but these are the two that you get out of, if you're a cultural fire practitioner. So it's a positive movement forward. This is also passed, so this is California law. They want to increase the pace and scale of prescribed and cultural burns and restore landscape resilience while I'm assisting Native American cultural identity projects. So it says right here that the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection is going to ensure cultural fire practitioners have access to appropriate insurance. So what they're saying is they're trying to find ways to provide funding, insurance coverage for organizations doing cultural burns. These are positive aspects of the law now. They have a liaison, that's a cultural burning liaison with the State Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, and they're required to actively engage Native American tribes in organizations and practitioners and recruit them as well. So hopefully with the changes in legislation, Native Health, Native Hands, and other organizations will be able to facilitate that. That was one of the goals, is getting more people involved, paid work, doing meaningful work. This is a tribal chairman saying that they're in support of that bill. And this one right here, 310, is not passed, just if you're looking at it. This one is the one that's not passed. This is one that's currently being sponsored and hopefully will be passed. And this would recognize tribal government sovereignty over cultural fires. This is an additional step. This is where if a tribe has, if it passes, if a tribe that is a federally recognized, it would just have to be a state recognized tribe here, actually, has a plan for a cultural fire, then within tribal lands, including ancestral territories of tribal lands, as long as the tribal documents say, hey, you call it, the whatever such mountain, a lot of these places are named after, plants or gathering areas, it doesn't have to be within tribal boundaries. It can just be within tribal ancestral homeland, as long as there's something to say, like, that's what we were saying. That then fires can be done in there with this type of exclusion. You don't need the CAL Fire and Air District permits, and there's no restriction based on time of year. And this was worded in a way because Northern California is very different than Southern California in terms of like, oh, now for the statewide we say there's no more prescribed burns. And it's like, well, maybe in San Diego County it does not make sense anymore, but what about, Del Norte, or what about, Mendocino? And what about local knowledge about conditions of whether or not someone should burn. So if this passes, it would allow recognized tribes to practice cultural fire within ancestral homelands with a lot of easier way to do it. So it's a positive legislation. This is a state law if it passes. It doesn't quite apply to some of these other agencies. But like we've heard that, California state parks isn't within that. So, if the tribe does go through with an actual burn plan certified by a certified burn boss, the insurance is covered. So these things are making it easier for cultural fire here in California. If this passes, it'll make it a lot easier. And I think that's it. I know we're going to break into groups, so I want to pass over the mic and make sure.